Hey everyone, it's Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from Our Sister Republics by Caitlin Fitz, and we'll be reading the final part called Destined by Providence. Manuel de Mer y Terron killed himself on July 3rd, 1832. Arising early, he donned his finest military uniform, walked to an old roofless church in eastern Mexico, and threw his body into a sword. He was only 43. A famed intellectual, engineer, and brigadier general, Mier y Terron had seen the future as a Mexican presidential contender, and he pointed to Texas as his greatest source of anguish. It was a place that haunted him for years, ever since he had traveled there to ensure that the region remained in Mexico's possession. His reports home read like an endless cascade of warnings and increasingly despair. In 1828, the incoming stream of new settlers is unceasing. Texas could throw the whole nation of Mexico into revolution. In 1829, the United States was the most avid nation in the world. The North Americans have conquered whatever territory joins them. In 1831, there is no physical force that can stop the entrance of the Norte Americanos. And then, in the very last of his suicide note, En que para Texas will become of terrorists. He repeated the question 3 other times throughout the letter. The next morning, he woke up and deliberately to his own death. Had Mier Terron survived his own despair, Texas's fate would have only deepened his sorrows. In 1836, Texas declared independence from the rest of Mexico. 9 years later, it was part of the United States, to be followed in 1848 by much of present-day New Mexico, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. Such a swift and sweeping transfer of territory had seemed like a far-fetched idea in the 1810s and early 1820s. Only a figment of policymakers and squatters' wildest imaginations, but in 1832, Mier y Terron saw the loss of Texas at least as imminent. To understand what happened, it's necessary to begin with the age of American revolutions, when few hemispheric enthusiasts thought very much about Mexico at all, except for those who lived nearby. Newspapers historically hailed Mexico's multiracial rebels with much of the same kind of optimism that they used in describing South Americans, but the rural Republicans who struggled immensely south of the border seemed less inspiring than their more victorious counterparts farther south. People almost never toasted Mexico at July 4th celebrations. Musicians rarely wrote odes in honor. Parents seldom named their sons of its generals. Texas, as a frontier province on the margins of Mexico's independence struggle, still received less attention in the popular festivities. Its 2,500 white and mestizo residents, overwhelmed by the border's roughly 25,000 Comanches and other native people. The popular ambiance found its parallel federal policy when the Transcontinental Treaty vote of 1819. U.S. senators unanimously abandoned claims to Texas in return for Florida. A strengthened claim was now the Pacific Northwest. In 1821, after Spain had finally approved the agreement as well, the Senate ratified the treaty with just 4 dissenting votes. Because the issue arose around the same time as the Missouri crisis, most policymakers were reluctant to acquire any more would-be slave states. The further acquisition of a territory to the west and the south involves difficulties of an internal nature, which menaced the Union itself. President Monroe ominously warned Thomas Jefferson in 1820. Having secured the Mississippi and erected the states here, ought we not to be satisfied? Although House Speaker Henry Clay protested the treaty's geographic reunification, a vast majority of legislators agreed that Texas was not the nation's most pressing concern. It could be, the A vote suggested, be attended to in time. That time, as turned out, came quickly. Triggered in 1821 by an event so seemingly innocuous that its importance became obvious only years later, when it seemed too late to stop what was already happening, hoping that foreign settlers might strengthen Texas's stagnant economy and fend off the government's Comanche, Apache, and other native rivals. Spanish officials granted a subject tract of eastern Texas land to a U.S. citizen named Moses Austin, who promised to bring 300 families along with him. Austin died shortly thereafter, just as Mexico was declaring independence from Spain, but his son Stephen inherited the title and went on to become the era's most successful empresioso, or immigration agent, as other empresarios joined in. The migration soared. By 1830, more than 7,000 white U.S. settlers had moved to Texas. 6 years later, nearly 35,000 white U.S. immigrants and black U.S. slaves lived there, outnumbering the native-born Tejanos, both white and mestizo, by a factor of 10. Nor was Texas alone. During the 1820s, along the Santa Fe Trail, which ran between Missouri and New Mexico, doubled every few years. So much species streamed into the United States that by the early 1830s, the Mexican silver peso had become Missouri's de facto currency. This was not what authorities in Mexico had wanted. Moderate, guided development had been the goal, but exponential growth rates along politically uncontrollably and culturally overpowering. Although some newcomers married local Tejano women and partnered with Tejano businessmen, most declined to assimilate. They did not learn Spanish, did not embrace Catholicism. They brought their slaves, thousands of them, even when Mexican laws frowned upon slavery, and even though U.S. laws forbade citizens from exporting slaves abroad. The colonists in Texas will not be Mexican than more in name, Mexico's minister in the United States feared. Fully aware of the United States' expansionist history in Florida, Baton Rouge, and elsewhere, Mexico City officials worried that the influx of the U.S. immigrants impelled the Republic. Where others sent invading armies, Mexico's Secretary of State warned that around 1830 the North Americans send their colonists. Although Mexico tried periodically to slow and even halt U.S. immigration, it could not reverse the trend. As Stephen Austin saw it, U.S. immigration was an unstoppable force of nature. Trying to dam out the North Americans, a bilingual bachelor remarked, would be like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. In one decade, Texas had gone from a remote proprietary of the Spanish Empire to a central concern for people throughout Mexico and the United States alike. The change happened so fast that it was hard to make sense of it. Our citizens are insistent in their applications for me for information to the property and advantage of settling the grant in Texas. Tennessee's governor told the U.S. Minister to Mexico, Jill Roberts Poisson, in 1825. But not having any correct knowledge on the subject, I am unable to satisfy their inquiries. In other words, interest in Texas surged quickly in the southwestern states like Tennessee, but the region remained unfamiliar even among those who wanted to learn more. His newly founded Texas Gazette put it in 1830, Texas was hitherto unknown, even the Mexicans themselves beginning to assume its proper station in the geography of America. Indeed, the geography of America was really changing as Texas stormed onto the scene. At least many in the United States saw it. While South America had dominated hemispheric excitement in the 1810s and early 20s, by the 1830s, Texas's astonishing growth placed that region front and center. Even the Monroe Doctrine began to look as different as U.S. immigrants piled up in Mexico and along the border. When in 1845, President James K. Polk invoked famous 1823 message to Congress, he spoke especially in reference of North America rather than referring to both American continents as Monroe had done. No future European colony or dominion, Polk denounced, would eye on Mexico, shall with our consent be planted or establish any part of North American continent. South America's independence struggles had faded into history. One manifestation of the age of revolutions is that if U.S. onlookers increasingly saw it had yielded two divergent Americas rather than one united hemisphere. The trend was gaping stark in gazettes and atlases. While U.S. mapmakers of the 1810s and 1820s usually referred to the Western Hemisphere as one American continent, Antebellum mapmakers increasingly portrayed the Western Hemisphere as two separate continents, North and South. Critically, those narrowing geographic locations brought new thematic concerns. While border conflicts between the United States and Spanish America had always simmered and periodically boiled over, excitement about South American republicanism had overshadowed those disputes for well over a decade in popular nationalist discord. By the late 1820s, the rush into Texas suggested a different storyline, one that was less about the spread of republicanism to all men and nations than it was about westward expansion and democratic quality for U.S. slaveholders. As population pressures mounted along the border, concrete confrontations over territory came to overwhelm the earlier and more abstract language of universalism. The expansionist crusade would have been powerful on its own, coupled with the rhetoric of white U.S. superiority that the 1826 Panama debates had helped inflame. It created an explosive state of affairs. Democrats sustained many of their Whig opponents, continued to portray the U.S. as separate and superior, a happily anomaly in the hemisphere of darker-skinned pretenders. Such language was only one step removed from the kind of full-blown national chauvinism that marked antebellum and expansionist appeals to manifest destiny. In other words, because the United States was supposedly whiter, smarter, and more successful, its people could invade Mexico and take whatever they liked. The nation's extraordinary political, demographic, and economic successes, as most whites received them, came to serve as prima facie evidence of U.S. virtue. It was not so much that might made right, but it was right made right. The country seemed vindicated by its own apparent greatness. Many in the United States saw their nation in such self-justifying terms that territorial bounds no longer applied to them. The first major upheaval came in 1835 and 1836. Vowing to preserve their autonomy from a new centralist government that had assumed power in Mexico City, white Anglos in Texas, along with their native-born Tejano allies, themselves frustrated a lack of federal protection from Comanche raids, declared independence under a pro-slavery constitution. Then their enslaved population, increasingly even faster than their free population. Texas expressed interest in joining the United States. The U.S. Senate resoundingly refused, concerned, among other things, that annexing would provoke Mexico and aggravate sectional tensions. But in 1845, expansionist and pro-slavery Southern Democrats devised a new and Machiavellian strategy. They would annex Texas through a joint congressional resolution, rather than through a treaty. As John Quincy Adams, now an elderly U.S. congressman with trembling hands and sparse white hair, saw it, Democrats had turned the Constitution into a menstruous rag. The solution squeaked through within months, and newly elected President James K. Polk proactively dispatched U.S. troops to the Rio Grande, an area everyone knows and that Mexico still claimed. War came in 1846, and in less than 2 years, Mexico had formally ceded half of its territory to the United States. Polk was disappointed. He wanted more. Simon Bolívars, who had passed away in 1830, had seen it coming. There is a head of this great continent, he warned his countrymen in 1822. A very powerful, very rich, very warlike, capable of anything. For all their universalistic rhetoric, white people in the United States had always wanted land, and they had usually been willing to fight for it. They invaded Canada, and they fought native people, and they strong-armed Spain and Mexico. That they did, even as they imagined themselves at the forefront of an international movement of freedom, not lost on Spanish-American onlookers, at least Bolívar. The United States, Venezuela's Libertador, famously wrote, as destined by Providence to plague America with miseries in the name of liberty. Ironic, Bolívar's language, destined by Providence, foreshadowed expansionist talk of manifest destiny in the 1840s and 1850s. Perhaps we can locate seeds of antebellum territorial aggression in the casual arrogance displayed by U.S. onlookers of the 1810s and 1820s, individuals who blithely assumed that their own revolution was responsible for everything good that seemed to be happening overseas, and who concluded that worked for the United States could work for everyone. Maybe it was no coincidence that the nation's major surge of international Republican favor rose in 1848 when self-styled young American Democrats sang the glories of European revolutionaries while simultaneously advocating expansion into Mexico and Cuba. Republican revolutions in far-off countries seemed to feel nationalist arrogance closer to home, and perhaps that arrogance could help pave the way for an antebellum conquest. Antebellum conquest, in turn, paved the way for still further war as conflicts over the fate of the New West magnified controversies between North and South. The United States might swallow Mexico, Ralph Waldo Emerson proselytized, but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic which brings him downturn. Mexico will poison us. Once again, the United States' relationship with its southern neighbors was helping to crystallize debates over slavery and equality at home. Through the immediate reality of the territorial expansion, increasingly dwarfed by the more abstract and often imagined inter-American relationship of the early 19th century, and talk of kinship quieted, some U.S. Southerners started to identify with the slaveholders of colonial Cuba and monarchical Brazil, fancying themselves at the forefront of an inter-American master race class. But when the sea of change from revolutionary change, white people throughout the nation have emphasized in solidarity Republican rebellion rather than solidarity in slavery. That earlier age raised questions about human equality in potent and lasting ways, as hemispheric rooted in bondage responds with cries for political and personal freedom. The cries persisted long after the Revolutionary Age had faded, so much that when the Confederate States declared their independence from the United States in 1860 and 1861, their new vice president, Alexander Stephens, felt compelled to address the issue of equality head-on. Thomas Jefferson was wrong, the 90-pound Georgian told a packed indoor audience one spring evening in Savannah as part of an attempt to rally voters against the new Confederate Constitution. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, and that it was wrong in principle socially, morally, and politically. The Confederacy, Stephens said, was finally getting it right. Our cornerstone rests. He proclaimed to waves of applause upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race in his natural normal condition, and those who still disregarded are fanatics, as Confederate President Jefferson Davis told a crowd in Atlanta the same year. For the future, we are embraced in the same moral category as Cuba and Brazil. It was a profound change from the universalist rhetoric of the early revolutionary era, as Stephens himself observed, perhaps not a total one. Early 19th century observers who had emphasized republicanism over race were stimulously downplaying race's importance, minimizing the scope of sin, and glossing over the depth of solutions that would be necessary for change. From Amelia Island to Panama, the universalist talk often proved passive and brittle, and that fairly made it easier for men like John Randolph and eventually Alexander Stephens to push further on behalf of bondage and inequality. But if revolutionary era ambience about race sowed seeds of antebellum discords, and if popular arrogance about U.S. greatness sowed seeds of antebellum expansionists, those seeds could not have sprouted and grown without a specific combination of environmental factors that had been uncertain futures by the nation's 50th anniversary in 1826, domestic partisanships, Texas slavery, Indian removal, Comanche rage, Mexican and United States immigration. And the United States celebrates its virtues in the 1810s and early 1820s. They focused more on republicanism, spread out to far-off corners of America, than on territorial aggrandizements closer to home. They toasted South America, not Mexico. They cheered Simon Bolívars, not filibusters. They focused on republicanism, not race. Before the storm of Panama, before the stream to Texas, and before expansion to Latin America helped spark the Civil War, the idea of a united Republican hemisphere prevailed with such force that people in the United States welcomed their multiracial and Catholic neighbors as sister republics. Okay, thank you.